Good morning, everyone. I'm Caroline Daniel, and I'm a partner at Brunswick, which I'm delighted to say has now got an office in Chicago. First of all, I'd just like to manage expectations a little. We are not actually going to be talking about the Oscar-winning film about a lonely janitor who falls in love with an amphibious, strange-looking creature. Instead, what we're going to be talking about is how can we use the future as a point of reference to shape water policy and indeed to shape solutions more generally in cities. And with me to talk about that, we have Henk Ovink, who is described in the New York Times as the Netherlands' globe-trotting salesman-in-chief for the Dutch expertise on the risk of water and climate change. And he's also the first special envoy for water. He's advised governments around the world and the Obama administration and every government from Jakarta to Myanmar on water policy. So that's Henk Ovink. We also have Maria Aiolova, who's the co-founder of Terreform, a not-for-profit group which looks at architecture, arts, and ecological urban design. And their aim is to inspire unique solutions for global sustainability. And I advise everyone to have a look at Maria's Twitter feed, which gives some idea of some of the kind of more innovative solutions her organization has been involved with, or the things that she gets to think about. So recently, she has tweeted about, can dirt save the earth? Live butterflies and robotic butterfly drones building the ecosystem. And the one I particularly liked, which we can also ask her about, is she shared the results of a 2018 fairy tale competition, which she was a judge on. So I think we're going to have some really interesting perspectives and hopefully some very innovative ideas from the panel. So what I'd like to do is start with Henk. And obviously, as a Dutchman, you have a long experience of some of the challenges and problems of water. And I think what was really interesting reading about the issue is how, and which I hadn't really known about, which is back in 1953, 1,800 people died and 50,000 properties were damaged in your country. And over half of the land is subject to flooding. So what I'd love to hear, obviously, is this is much more existential for the Dutch in terms of the challenges of water. Can you just sort of share your perspective about how growing up in your country has completely changed the way you think about water?
Yes, thank you, Caroline. And it's great to be here on stage with Maria to talk about water. The Netherlands is a country that is made out of water. We started it thousands of years ago. And critically important to that was around 900 years ago, we started to organize ourselves around this. And that part of the water democracy, regional water authorities in the 1100s, forging coalitions on the scale where water matters most, became the base for our real democracy, our constitution, ages after. So thousands of years of working together helped us recover after disasters. And of course, as a country, a flood-prone country, in a delta like so many other urbanizing deltas in the world, we have these risks every time. Floods in the 1400s, 1800s, and in 53, where almost 2,000 people were killed. And it helped us realize again, so like every disaster, realizing that the future is more uncertain, and it really doesn't make sense to respond to the disaster that you just had. You have to use the disaster as an opportunity to look ahead and tackle the future challenges. And that's what we did with our Delta program, looking ahead, as we do now, more than 100 years, take that future as a reference with everything we build, being it infrastructure or housing or urbanization, green infrastructure, blue infrastructure, and so forth. So after 53, again, a collaborative approach, building infrastructure that will safeguard the nation for the next century and not respond to the past. Past solutions are set to fail in that challenges the future has. And water is so critically important. 90% of all disasters in the world are water-related. 80% of climate adaptation is linked to water. Water is about equity and emancipation, health, food, and energy. And we tend to forget. And all these risks, if we understand that, we can turn them into rewards. And that's what we showed with our approach after our big hurricane and our flood in 53. And that is also the learning we want to bring to the world. And that's why I became an ambassador for water, to forge coalitions in any place, being it Bangladesh or South Africa, to think about water differently and come up with solutions collaboratively so we can actually change for the better.
But how do you create that sense of jeopardy in a country where you don't have that kind of existential threat?
Well, we have an existential threat, but it's not so apparent because we build our standards towards floods that might occur every 10,000 years. You know, in reference, the US thinks about storms every 100 years, so the risks are differently diverted. And the awareness in the Netherlands starts when you're very young. And I think you know it, but in the Netherlands, you're obliged to have a swimming diploma when you're a little kid. And they changed actually these exercises. Now you throw in your kid when it's like 3 or 4 years old with all its clothes on into the water and then see what happens. And of course, you know, we are around to safeguard it, but it's really about understanding water as a way for life, as a central part of our culture. And I think that's the critical part that's so important. We don't see water as an engineering task.
Yeah.
It's policy, engineering and design and urbanization, yes. But it's also economy and social and cultural. And breathing water, living water, is the essence of how we organized ourselves, but also how we live every day.
And Maria, if I can bring you in terms of some of the work you're doing, what would be wonderful to hear is obviously you're much more sort of community-based and trying to come up with sort of very much ground-up solutions to some of the challenges of water in cities in particular. I wonder if you can give me an example of something that you've been doing in New York in this area.
Definitely. So we've been working with the community of Red Hook in Brooklyn, New York, and it's right across the waterway from Wall Street, 10 minutes by ferry now, but it's the poorest neighborhood in whole of the city, and it was completely underwater during Superstorm Sandy. So it's still left behind, and we're working with the community, and especially with the young residents. They have a big part of the community lives in public housing projects, and we've been engaging mostly young men from the housing projects through a program called Digital Stewards. And it's the idea to create drone mappings for community resilience. So we are creating 3D maps of the shape of water or where the water is going to go. And we're doing this in a granular level so we can understand every block, every corner. And these digital stewards then work with the residents to alert them that they need to protect their basements and their storage. So they have access to the community, but they're developing this new information, practicing what I'll call citizen science. And it's a new approach. It's not just engagement, but empowering the community by giving them the tools to create solutions.
And just on the issue of sort of innovative solutions, Henk, obviously one of the things I've been reading about is how you've come up with completely different ways of, rather than rebuilding the cities in the same way, how do you build in more resilient cities? And obviously in the Netherlands you have some extraordinarily interesting swimming pools and rowing farms and pavements and initiatives which you're now sort of advising governments on around the world. Can you talk through some specific examples of different kinds of interventions like along the lines of Maria's?
Yeah, and I think one of the latest examples we call Room for the River. We had to evacuate 250,000 people in 1995. And again, these crises are reminders for us to change. And I mean, traveling around the world, coming to the most worst water insecure places right now, when we say a crisis is an opportunity, we have to be very careful. Because with a real crisis, real people really die, and real lives are lost and assets are lost. So it's not an opportunity in the sense, oh, great, but it's at least, it's like an X-ray. It showcases all your vulnerability when a disaster happens, being it a drought or a flood. And 1995 was such a massive X-ray on the Netherlands, the lowest point in Europe, where all the water comes in from Germany, France, Belgium, and Switzerland. And if we don't manage that right, you know, we're drowning. And then we looked at our river system. And there's so many river systems around the world, being it here in Chicago or in New York, in Africa, Asia, the Middle East, or Latin America. We use our rivers as economic assets, but not as environmental, cultural, and social assets. and that means we channel them up for infrastructure uses, and then they lose the capacity to actually hold the water in when there is too much, and they can grow and flow when they're a normal river and meander. So we looked at our river system and we said we did the same by agriculture and urbanization, closing them off. And you see it here, also in Chicago, or in London for that matter. The river is not the asset. We either turn our back to it or make it smaller. The Olympic Games in London were a great example on opening up the river again and giving it back its capacity to flow. And that program, Room for the River, moving people out of harm's way, not by demand, but by collaboration, letting them develop the best solutions for their farms, their villages, their cities, and in that collaborative effort, at the same time, create that added value for the environment and for safety. We did a law for that, and in the law, 2 principles were critical. Safety, of course, for land and assets and people, but also quality. Quality for the environment and quality for every human being along those rivers.
And just on the issue of collaborations, obviously at the heart of your organization is how to form completely unique collaborations from, urban architects to people on the ground. Can you talk to me about some of the challenges and opportunities and why you think that's a really valuable approach? And also, just how hard is it to do that?
Well, we believe that innovation today doesn't happen in isolation. It needs this charged space where exceptional cross-disciplinary ideas can freely flow. And also it needs a community of these people who critically understand invention and are able to do that by sharing knowledge. And we've been creating these collaborative spaces in programs where we invite everybody to participate in a process. We actually coined a new profession that we call the urbaneer. And these new types of professionals, their job is to pioneer and reinvent the urban realm. And they range from designers to planners to developers, but also firefighters and teachers and chefs are invited to participate in this process.
Can you give an example of how that's worked? Because I think that's a really rare sort of coalition of different people in a community.
Well, we have a think tank and a forum of ideas, and we work on different collaborative projects. We talked earlier about the idea of a cricket farm, creating a shelter that is also a farm to grow crickets as a source of protein. And the UN reported 3 years ago that in order to sustain the growing population, we all be eating insects in the future. And we wanted to create this farm that is the most hygienic and sustainable way to grow crickets. And we had to invite both the biologists and scientists and farmers who understand the process, but also the chefs. So we worked with Michelin-level chefs in New York City, and we invited them to come and cook crickets with us. And now they want to introduce that in their restaurants.
Tell me what it was like eating a Michelin-starred cricket.
It was very delicious.
And what do they do with it? How do they put it on a plate?
Well, one of the chefs says, in order to make people eat it, you have to make it delicious and you have to make it hedonistic. And then everybody will like it. So we had cricket cream puffs, for example, that were very good.
So have you got a bag of crickets in your fridge now?
Yeah, I have some cricket chips.
So if anyone wants some crickets in your house, go to see Maria in New York. She's got some in her fridge. Learning the lessons about culture. Obviously, I'd be interested in your experience of going to different countries around the world and where you find sort of cultural resistance to your message. I mean, it seems very credible to us. It's obviously worked in the Netherlands. But where do you find some of the tensions and the politics in the water debate?
I think everywhere, also in the Netherlands. Change is tough. We like to keep things as they are. This is a fact. Although I'm happy to work with a lot of young and innovative people around the world that don't see the future as a negative challenge, but as a real opportunity to innovate. And if it's Gaza, which is under threat every day, it's the young again that come together. and really see opportunities, or Bangladesh or Myanmar. But I like to pick up on what Maria said. After Hurricane Sandy, I worked on President Obama's Hurricane Sandy task force and developed an approach called Rebuild by Design that was really that, bringing everyone together from around the world in those communities and trying to develop solutions together. So the federal government and the Christie administration, together with local communities, businesses, chefs, and so forth, we did workshops and bike tours and bake-outs and travel, as much as thorough research on these interdependencies, and then started to work with schools and kids and community organizations developing solutions. And one of them was off of Staten Island. One of the teams worked together with a water school, and they bring together all kids from around New York to learn and teach about water. It's the Harbor School. And we did a billion oyster project, and it's still happening. Bringing back the oysters in the New York Bite, but actually working with all the restaurants in Manhattan and in Brooklyn, so they can give the leftover material of the oyster after you eat the inside, you can give back the shells, and they use it to build oyster reefs that actually protect the coast, but also increase the environment and the ecology, so you can swim again, but also you can eat your oysters. Now you can't eat the oysters in the New York Bite, but over time you might.
I think I'd be happy with the oysters than the crickets.
Yeah, we do both, you know. Yeah, we'll make a recipe.
So just sort of, again, just perhaps expanding to the macro problem about water. I think you just told me you just completed a 3-year study of some of the, where the water challenges are showing up in the world and how multidimensional they are. So it's not just about sort of floods and the conventional understanding of it. Can you just give, even though it's a 3-year project, can you just give us in a few minutes a summary of some of the lessons and what you've learned from it in terms of the key priorities people should be thinking about?
Yeah. Traveling the world, I found that we lack the bigger understanding of these challenges water brings us. So I started a project with an international group of researchers. And we just presented a report, The Geography of Future Water Challenges. And it looks at how water is connected to energy, to food, to migration and national insecurity, to urbanization, of course. And looking at the world, you see a growth of population and a growth in cities. And it's exactly these places that are more at risk. If you look at floods, for instance, there's floods everywhere around the world. But there's only one place where floods really hit massive amounts of people. When Hurricane Harvey hit Houston, people suffered. In the same week, 1,200 people died in Bangladesh, India, and Nepal because of floods. Not in the news, but in reality. South and Southeast Asia are hit hardest, and communities are hit hardest there. Making the mix between water and urbanization is one. Water and energy. We will build another almost 4,000 dams in the world, dams and rivers that will block off these rivers for flow, also will collect the water, so mostly vulnerable communities have to move out of harm's way, out of these dams, and causing a lot of problems downstreams in the sedimentation of these rivers. And then as you see on the Louisiana coast, the coast is disappearing with the speed of a football field every hour, because the sedimentation and the diversion of the Mississippi River are not treated in the context of the environmental capacity a river has. So bringing that together in one study also helps showcase way forward on the very small scale. And one of the conclusions from these scientists working around the world was we have to start to work together differently. So our governance system from a government perspective has to change, but our collaborative approach, including everyone, every stakeholder in an approach to build that capacity moving forward is critically important.
And Maria, when you're working with these collaborations and you're listening to the sort of solutions, what would you want to bring to, the examples that you've been working on, which might help in sort of areas outside the US? In terms of, sort of, a model of way of including farmers and firemen and people on the ground in a very different way.
Yes, so we worked in Cape Town with the Philippine horticultural area. And I actually brought US college students with me to these projects. And for those of you who don't know, the Philippine horticultural area, it's the breadbasket and of Cape Town. It also sits on the top of the biggest aquifer in the area, and it's being threatened by destruction from silica sand mining and also development. And it was important to empower, these are mostly women and youth farmers, 3,000 to 4,000 a year that are being employed with these digital tools that we have been developing, again, to understand the shape of underground water. And we showed them how to use hydrology maps, but also how to use social media tools to advocate, because the government is very much pro-development and pro-mining. But the idea is that we need this policy to preserve this aquifer for the future generation. And it has to come from within, and empowering the farmers, again, to advocate for themselves, but also to know where to farm and where is the water and how it's going to be replenished. And there is room for development if you really invest into this knowledge and collaboration.
And what was the impact of that project, if you had to sort of look back on it now? And how is it sort of continuing to motivate people on the ground in a very different way?
I mean, I think one of the most important things was organizing these women. It was interesting because they started coming to the meetings with my students, and then suddenly we brought computers, and the men started to show up. And they said, well, what happened to the women farmers? It's like, well, now it's men's job because there are computers involved, right? And we were like, no, we want the women who were trained to come. So we went door to door and brought them back, and I think still get a lot of emails from them. They built their first Facebook page, and now they're very active. So we gave them both the tools how to advocate, but also the knowledge, and they're now developing new pieces of land where developers were throwing rubbish, and now they've cleaned them because they know there's water underneath, and it can become arable land.
And Henk, just sum up for us, how bad is it in Cape Town? I mean, obviously we've read a lot about it in the news.
Well, Cape Town, Maria, I think experienced the same as a man-made disaster. And if we blame climate change, we actually can't look ourselves in the mirror. Cape Town failed to really think about water usage and water reuse and reduction of that use with the industry, advocating for the wrong projects in the wrong place, not taking care of natural resources at all. And now thinking about the desalination plant that all of a sudden will be the mother of all things, but will never solve the crisis in Cape Town because it's cultural and very much political. So the crisis is big, but it's also solvable by these type of bottom-up approaches, but also real policy and political change. Real water crisis when it comes to drought is not Cape Town. You see it in Africa and the Middle East, where millions of people right now are fleeing their places where they live because there's no cattle, there's no food, everything died, and they have no place to go, with massive rippling effects of child prostitutions in cities and conflicts and until even uncertainties like wars. So Cape Town is a rabbit on the road looking at the headlights and thinking, well, the car might go away. But it really demands change from every aspect, from our government, businesses as a whole.
And talking of politics, you said to me just now a rather striking statement. You said, any mayor so this is for all the mayors in the room, any mayor who says we're going to be the most resilient city is a liar.
The most water resilient city, because it's like you like to advocate for that. And I heard one of the mayors say it on Wednesday. And I think it's going to be very tough. It's a wicked challenge, and it's not solved a very single-focused and simple approach forward. So embrace that complexity, because I think, and I experience in all these places around the world, that if you do that, you come up with the best solutions. And then you become a water-resilient city in that future, but don't focus on being the champion of something, of a competition you can't win. Start to work with the community, with the businesses, with everyone to forge these coalitions and build innovative solutions for the future and not repeat the mistakes of the past.
And I'm going to end with Maria on the sort of future innovation. Is there enough funding for sort of genuinely unusual collaborations and future-leaning projects? Maria, and then I'm going to finish on Henk on this very quickly.
Not really, and especially for the NGOs and nonprofits and universities, we are also always struggling for funding. But what is happening now that the private practice in the industry is starting to do the research and innovation, and reading the reports coming from the engineering firm Arab, for example, they're really on the bleeding edge of thinking about the future of cities and what we need to accomplish.
We're out of time, I'm afraid, so I'm not going to, unless you have very quick answers to that.
I think we need $1 million to spend our billions right, but we don't focus on those millions. So we have money to implement projects, but we don't have money for the process to actually get the best projects we need to implement. And that is critically important, and with those millions, we can forge those coalitions across every layer of society, and especially in these cities, hotspots of risks, we can turn them into hotspots of rewards.
Great. That's a very optimistic note to end on. Can you join me in thanking our panelists?